Welcome to everybody who has joined us and who will watch this on YouTube after the fact. I am Dr. Megan Clark. I am the co-chair of our St. John's CRS Global Campus Committee, which organizes panels related to global justice. Together with my co-chair, Victoria O'Keefe, we welcome all of you to learn about this project that I have been privileged to be part of, doing theology from the existential peripheries. Listening in North America is our focus for today. I myself was assistant coordinator, academic on the brain, assistant coordinator for the North American Working Group, and I'm really excited to bring together our regional coordinator and two of our colleagues to share what it is that we learned and what it is that we embarked on, doing a project on going out to host listening sessions and meet with people on the peripheries of society and of the church, specifically taking up Pope Francis's call and doing so as part of a global project for the Migrant and Refugee Section of the Dicastery for the promotion of integral human development at the Holy See, or what most people call the Vatican. As is our custom, we are going to begin, as we always do, with prayer. And so I would ask Sarah Khan, who is, if I get this right, the social media coordinator and vice president of our CRS Ambassadors for Global Justice, to lead us in prayer.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. O God, creator and owner of all that exists, you have given us rule over the works of our hands and put all things at our feet because you made everything good. However, our ambitions has led us to act selfishly, to find ways to use up our gifts and discard them when they are no longer useful to us. Holy Father, do not let us be indifferent to what is happening around us. Send your Holy Spirit to water our arid hearts with hope, stoke in us the flame of fraternity. Give us set the world on fire with acts of justice in favor of those who suffer most. Transform our attitudes and make our minds fertile to new ways of living. Enlighten us to propose, support, and defend projects and laws that protect the environment. Take our hands to till ways of solidarity and make our works and words bear fruit. Send your Holy Spirit. Make a wind that changes the way we relate to each other and to nature. Make us overflow with joy once again when we contemplate your wonders. Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Sarah.
Of course.
It is now my pleasure to introduce the panel. And we have with us today Father Stan Chu Ilo, who was our regional coordinator for the project, research professor of world Christianity, ecclesiology, and African studies at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at Depaul University. Father Darren Diaz, OP, associate professor of systematic theology at the University of St. Michael's at Toronto School of Theology, and prior of the Priory of St. Thomas Aquinas, and Jennifer Owens Jofré, Manresa postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Ignatian Spirituality at St. Louis University, and a research associate at the University of San Diego. Welcome to all of you. As we get started, Stan, you were involved at the very beginning of this project and of putting it all together and working with the Dicastery and the people in Rome. Can you share a little of the background of the project and how it came about and the project as a whole?
Thank you very much, Megan. First, the project as described on the official website is a project of the Migrants and Refugees Section of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development at the Holy See. And it aims at deepening the teaching of Pope Francis and promoting a renewal of theology. Now, that begins basically for this project from encountering those at the existential peripheries and lifting up the wisdom that they carry. And I think there are three important ideas that came together in giving birth to this very important project. First, I think the use of the term existential peripheries have been a central category in understanding the central impulses of the papacy of Francis. You remember in his first speech to the crowd at St. Peter's Square, when he was elected, he said, and I quote, "It seems that my brother cardinals have come almost to the ends of the earth to get him." So he defines himself from the existential peripheries, the tension between the center and the margins. So just like him, Pope Francis sees the church as called today to go to the ends of the earth, outside the centers of power, to the peripheries. Second is the objectification of those on the existential peripheries. For example, migrants and refugees in Europe and North America, the negative tags about them that we hear in political discussions in the US, Italy, UK, France, Spain, many other countries. Pope Francis believes, as he said in Evangelii Gaudium, that these siblings of ours have much to teach us, hence this project. Then finally, I think, is that this project was a demonstration model of how to do consultation in the church. It was conceived as a staging ground for theologians and pastoral agents to learn a different way of doing theology, where the texts are not found in the libraries, but in the stories of those at these peripheries. If we remember in Veritatis Gaudium number 5, Pope Francis calls theology spiritual ethnography and invited theologians to do a theology from the laboratory. And that laboratory for him is found among the least of the brethren. Therefore, the hermeneutical integration that is required in doing theology should provide resources for the church for pastoral accompaniment as well as for understanding where God is speaking to us today. I think that this was the ideas that converged from conversations, good conversations among some of the top staff at the Dicastery, and then some of us were brought into that conversation, and there was a huge enthusiasm that this is a different way of enacting a synodal process for those whose voices are often muted in our church because they're outside the cities, outside the walls, outside the centers of our academic institutions. So I think that's kind of a background information about how all these this wonderful project began to come together.
Thank you. And one of the things that really was remarkable as this project took shape and as it went on and concluded is that as we looked around here in North America and in other parts of the world, you had regional divergences, but you also had an awful lot of convergence in who it was that everyone sought out to talk to in the communities that are slightly different, but at the core, one of the things I noticed is that those who are excluded by the power structures in our societies also tend to be those who feel excluded from within our church as well. And I know for me, as we started, it was particularly important, as Stan in particular knows, because we went together down to El Paso and Juarez. It was very important to me that that we go down to the border region and capture listening to the faith experience of the people who live there, as well as the migrants who are moving through. The t-shirt I'm wearing today is from La Mujer Obrera, one of the communities that we visited in El Paso, coordinated by Hope. How did each of you seek, because we were all in different cities. A couple of us went to El Paso, but I was in New York. Darren, you're in Toronto. Jen, you were in San Diego, and Stan in Chicago. I want to start with Darren, and just how did you determine who you were going to approach for listening sessions and who you thought needed to be captured in order for to recognize the existential peripheries in Toronto?
Thanks, Megan. I think that one thing that I was attentive to was that we met as a group, the 7 or 8 of us who were involved in this project in North America. And that was important for me to think through together. So even in choosing who we were going to go to and the methodologies we would employ, I really felt like it wasn't just me, it was a team effort. So we sort of performed that synodal sense. So I would say one thing that was really important was the conversations that we were having. And, Stan would say, I'm going here or there. I think this is really important. And maybe Jamie would say, I think this, I'm going to go here. And so we sort of, I think we collaborated really, really well in thinking about who we wanted to hear, who we wanted to listen to, and who was important to listen to. So that was one important criteria, was our own group discussion. Because, as I thought about who you could possibly think about as being on the peripheries and on the margins, like that list grew longer and longer and longer. And it was certainly, in the work that we did, we couldn't cover it all, the 7 or 8 of us. So certainly one of us couldn't cover it all. So the collaboration of the group was one thing. And then what I did, and I think it was advice that came through our meetings also to some of the expert sociologists. I listened to the first group that I interviewed, the Catholic Network for Women's Equality, and they were in such solidarity with other people on the margins that I asked them. And then I asked my next group so I actually, by the end of it, I wasn't thinking of my own. The first 2, I had to come up with on my own. I had to start somewhere. And that was in collaboration with our group. And then I listened and asked those groups, who do we need to go to now? You've experienced this project. And they gave me some suggestions, and they were great suggestions. So I followed them. So in a way, maybe I didn't do my work. I let other people do my work for me. But since this was really an exercise in listening, I thought I would try and perform it even in who I decided to go out to listen to.
That's a really beautiful way of proceeding, Darren. That kind of, listening to who those you're listening to think should be listened to more. When Stan and I were in Juarez, we met with a sister who was running Casa Eudes, who was running a shelter for mothers and young children who were along their migration path. And they were all Mexican sisters, but none of them were from Juarez. And she described their work as that they were all migrants, accompanying migrants and being accompanied by migrants. And that came to mind as you were talking about asking and letting yourself be guided by the people you were listening to. Jen, what about you? How did you approach your work and you were in San Diego at the time, in Southern California?
I was, yeah. And I mean, I would echo sort of the first part of Darren's response in terms of the gift that that this team was in that regard, right? Some of those preparatory meetings that we'd started earlier this year. And I think too, I'm trained as a Hispanic theologian, and Hispanic theology very much underlines the importance of context. We talk about it as lo cotidiano, as daily living, as a resource for theological construction. So in some ways, some of the sort of structure of the project in terms of method was familiar to me in that regard, and also resonated with some of my training as a practical theologian. So the question that I sort of sat with had to do with sort of whose voices need to be heard in this particular context, right? Like in that, or well, in that context of San Diego, yeah. And of course, I mean, given our proximity to the U.S.-Mexico border, I mean, that was something that came to my mind. But as you had pointed out, Megan, even though I have roots in Southern California, I'd only been living in San Diego about 6 months when I started to work with y'all on this project. So I had a sort of rough idea of where to start, but I also took into my confidence a few of my colleagues in the Theology and Religious Studies department. I met with a couple of other folks who have training in Hispanic theology, as well as a white theologian who studied under a womanist theologian. And I just sort of said, you know, here's the sort of broad strokes of what we're up to, who in this context, given, you know, these broad strokes, do you think we should spend more time with, right? And it's sort of through my reflection on those conversations and trying to sort of listen to the movement of the Spirit in my own sort of prayer time that I really focused on migrants and the folks who accompany them. So I sat with folks from San Diego Organizing Project. It is a faith-based community organizing effort, but the folks that I met with for one of those listening sessions were all Catholic, first of all, right? And all had sort of different experiences with migration themselves. And that was part of sort of how they had come to the work of community organizing, often focusing not only on migration and human trafficking, but also more local issues around incorporation of some of the areas in which they were organizing. And I also spent a little bit of time with a woman named Mary. She's a vowed religious sister who had just started an intentional community of vowed religious women and other lay people called Casa de Misericordia, Mercy House. And the mission of that intentional community is to accompany migrants and to be accompanied by migrants, as you were saying, Megan. So those were sort of two groups that I focused on initially in those conversations. I was blessed and lucky to meet with other folks as well, but the folks at SDOP, as they abbreviate it, and Casa de Misericordia very much had an impact on my work in this effort. I'm very grateful to them for that.
What I think is so beautiful about this is I think is highlighting what Stan mentioned at the very beginning about how this shows a way of doing theology and of collaborating, that, you know, that this wasn't just something that was done one-off in this global collaboration, but a way in which we could do things differently in the future. Stan, in Chicago, how did you and in Chicago, you had a small team as part of the group because Jamie Waters was there as well as Bill Kavanaugh. How did you, out of your own experience in Chicago, determine what particular margins and peripheries that you were going to focus on?
Thank you, Megan. I think Darren already said my mind in terms of first, as the regional coordinator, I had to make sure that everything we did was done in a consultative manner, because we were a community of practitioners who loved each other and respected each other. And I think that the voices of each and every one of us were channels through which I heard the voice of God. So even though I had an intuitive sense of who I wanted to go and talk to, but I also felt there's a collective sense in which we are becoming accountable for creating these margins, these peripheries, ignoring them, and even some sense in which we needed a conversion process, which Father Bill at the Precious Blood Ministry reminded us about, who is actually at the peripheries and who is at the center. So how we create these categories. So I was very, very conscious and sensitive to this, that if I might use that term of Bernard Lonergan, mutual self-mediation. So who is actually out there and who is in there. So intuitively, as I listened, my focus began to shift from where I wanted to go immediately to actually listening to where God is calling me to go, to hear God's voice. So I not only spoke with our group in the workshop we had, but I also consulted with different pastoral agents here in Chicago, including the Archbishop, who was very, very kind in Cardinal Supich in giving me some of his own thoughts. And then I spoke and met several times with Bill and spoke also with Jamie. And so for me, I kind of then narrowed down the place the sites I visited. First was I have always personally been pained by the marginalization of women in the church. So I love my mother. My closest friend was my late sister, who died during pregnancy. Many women die in Africa, in Latin America, in India, just doing the most beautiful thing, giving birth. And I know sisters who helped me as a seminarian when I was sick in the hospital with river blindness. I could have been blind by now. I had filariasis, river blindness. I know my friends who are blind because of that disease. It's a nun who helped me. So I wanted to give a space for these women to lament the increasing marginalization. And when I visited the Sisters of St. Joseph, it was really a very moving experience, but it's also very painful to see these wise women with rich experiences not being used. Like our church has so much talent, and we have woefully failed in using this talent. Then secondly, I wanted also to meet our siblings who self-identify as in the LGBTQ community. I had done a second PhD research on the rights of same-sex persons in the Catholic Church, something I did out of a concern I have that the church cannot be reactionary to social issues. We must be actors. And so I wanted to listen again because the people I consulted during my research were mainly teenagers and adolescents. So now I looked at adults. So, and I am an immigrant. I have been an immigrant in Rome, in Canada, and now in the United States. So I wanted to give voice to my fellow immigrants, and I think those three. But then, in the course of our conversation here in Chicago, knowing the devastating impact of racism and the prison industrial complex here in the United States, and people who look like me make up 42% of the population of the jails. So I wanted to go to the jails and see things for myself and tell the stories of my own people, because, it's such a painful thing, but it was also a liberating thing for me in the sense that the people who are there, they are resisting oppression, they are resisting pain. So those are the things, if I say in general, that determined where I went. in the course of this project.
Thank you. It is interesting and unsurprising the way in which, and I too, we're all echoing the collaborative nature of the way that the group worked together, and the way in which interactions in the listening session shaped who we spoke to next, as well as our own social locations. I know for me in New York, it was particularly important for me to find ways to reach out and listen to communities that are generally treated in New York City as if they're not here. When they're rendered invisible, but they are here. People who, in essence, maybe in the pew over from us, and yet are rendered invisible or pushed out for a host of reasons, either because of migration status, or due to things like being in the LGBT community or gender. One of the things that I know I would be remiss without mentioning is that also meant confronting my own limitations, which meant that not only in El Paso did we need the staff of Hope, but in New York, I had colleagues like John Gonzalez and Ana Tavares who helped because I do not speak Spanish. And one of the most powerful interviews was with a woman named Josefa, who is at a cooperative called Sure We Can in Brooklyn. And what she's a recycler. And her experience of holding on to her faith, despite not feeling like she was welcome in any particular parish around where she's lived, and despite being treated with real disdain and sometimes what I would say violence, in terms of describing, people throwing things at her, dumping water out windows on her heads as she's collecting cans from the trash to recycle them. She turned around and said that they don't really understand what it is that they're doing, that she prays for them. And that, what she knows of Pope Francis is that they're doing their part in cleaning up the environment, right? So waste pickers who exist all over the world, and they tend to be recyclers here in the United States, are, right, they're contributing to the common good, and oftentimes contributing more to the common good than people who make lots more money than they do, in terms of cleaning up their community and cleaning up the earth itself. And that, for me, that was one particular interview where I was just stopped in my tracks with the dignity and grace of her compassion for those who treat her so badly. As you think back over the listening sessions that you had, what is one or two moments that like you, where what you felt like there was grace in that moment in particular, in the powerful witness to faith that you were listening to? And this time I'm going to start with Jen as we move it around.
Thanks, Meg. A couple of ideas come to mind. The first one is from one of the women that I talked with from San Diego Organizing Project. Again, SDOP is a faith-based community organizing effort that's connected with PICO, Faith in Action. But I spoke with Catholic organizers who have some sort of personal relationship to migration. One of them is named Wendy, and she said, when you have a heart that's ready for the work, God gives you the tools. And I don't know about you, but it sounds a little bit like boom, like God, sort of, it sends a lightning bolt down from the sky and suddenly you have tools. But this insight that she shared, I think is a lot deeper than that. Right. And I will say, too, I'm thinking about the former pastor at Dolores Mission, Father Ted, who describes Our Lady of Guadalupe as having untied his tongue when he was trying to learn Spanish. He was saying, I developed this devotion and she really helped me sort of communicate with this community that I'd been immersed in. But I don't know that all of us necessarily have that direct line to La Virgencita, right? In the way that Father Ted does. And so I'm thinking about sort of, Wendy's insight in terms of what it means to have a heart that's ready. Like, what does it mean to have a heart that's truly open? Because I think more often than not, when God gives us tools, it's not so much through a lightning bolt, right? Or through untying our tongue, but it might be a person or a resource or an opportunity. Like, I'm thinking too about some of what Mary from Casa de Misericordia had said about how when she first felt called to the border, she was saying, I speak English and that's it. Right. And, I've done a lot of different kinds of things during my life as a sister, but nothing quite like this. But she trusted and she sort of had a sense of what she didn't know. Right. And started talking with other folks who felt similarly called about that sort of balance between not necessarily having the sort of perfect constellation of skills in hand, but still sort of seeking out those places where they would need formation, where they would need training, and not using the sort of not using that as a reason not to proceed, right? But rather sort of saying, we will pick it up along the way. We will sort of figure it out as we go. And I also just want to share a couple of images that will help me explain this next piece. So the image that you see on the screen is called My Version of Mary. And it was created by Fabian de Bora. He is the executive director of Homeboy Industries' art education efforts. And he's very open in his testimony about his struggles with gang life, with addiction, among other things. And one of the things that he has articulated, I think, really beautifully is this sense that his art is a way of making something beautiful out of his experiences of tragedy, out of those challenges that he's experienced in his life. And I just see that theme sort of coming through throughout the conversations that I had with different folks through this project. I think everyone that I listened to very much took an experience of suffering and turned it into something beautiful. Some of the women from Beginning Experience, which is a ministry that's sort of by and for divorced and widowed Catholics, talked about their experiences either of divorce or of widowhood as a kind of death. Right. And in the sort of community that they built with one another, they were sort of experiencing, small resurrections, like this testimony to what life could be like on the other side of an experience that none of them set out to have. Right. Especially not when they were, first engaged and married. And then there's a second image I'd like to share. This, as you can see on the screen, is a sketch for a portrait of Rita Chaires by J. Michael Walker. He's an artist that has accompanied the Dolores Mission community in Boyle Heights. And Rita is very much at the center, I think, of the women, the lay Latina women in leadership in that Jesuit Catholic parish in Los Angeles. And I had talked with her about participating in this project, and she really had a lot of energy for it. She works with an organization, or worked, I should say, with an organization called Healing Hearts, Restoring Hope. Her own experience of life has been marked by loss in some ways. She lost two of her brothers to violence in the neighborhood, and it was through the intercession of Our Lady of Mary, through her prayer with her, and through her participation in restorative justice circles, in these sort of listening circles between survivors and perpetrators of violent crime, that she was able to sort of accept what had happened to her family, and actually forgive the folks who had caused this violence, who had taken the lives of her brothers. And it's through that experience that she started working herself with Healing Hearts Restoring Hope and running sort of similar restorative justice circles. And so she had intended to bring some of the folks that she works with regularly together for a listening circle for this project, but unfortunately had been struggling with health issues for several months and had an emergency that prevented her from being able to do that this summer. And so my hope is that we would be able to sort of pick up where we left off at some point in the future in a way that honors her memory.
Thank you. It highlights, Rita's story really highlights both the deep desire that I think everyone involved in this project experienced from communities and persons who wanted to be asked about their faith, wanted to be asked about their journeys and their stories, but also the precarity of their lives and things like the impact of long-term health inequalities and inequities that plague our societies. And I think it's beautiful that you've been able to honor her memory in the project, even though unfortunately things did not. She was unable herself to participate in the way that everyone had hoped. But it is, all of the people we talk to live in I was always acutely aware of a much greater precarity than certainly I live in. Stan, was there one interview or moment that really stuck with you from your interviews?
Yeah, there were so many that I would say, for lack of time, on my altar, my private altar here at my residence, I have a small stone that I placed on that altar. I don't know if I told you, Megan, after our meeting with the Center of Solidarity for those whose family members had disappeared, Alejandro said he wanted to speak to me. Alejandro lost his brother. His brother disappeared, so he's never seen his brother, and he's been searching for 8 years. He's been trying to find someone who can comfort him. And so he sought to see the parish priest, and he couldn't see the priest. The priest had no time for him. And so the only way Alejandro could see the priest was then to go to the confessional, knowing that he will find the priest there. And then he opened his heart to this priest to say, what is it I have done that God is punishing us this way? What did my brother do that God allowed this to happen? Where is my brother? So the priest says to him, your brother is in hell. He's in hell. So the priest judged his brother, had no empathy, thinking, oh, he's in hell. He's one of these narco traders or gangs and whatever it is. Alejandro left the church and lost his faith in God, in church. I would say in church rather than in God, because he continued to believe. So the only thing that remained, he went to the last place he was together with his brother and collected some pieces of stones to make that connection. Wherever you are, brother, we are connected. And he gave me one piece of that and said, please remember my brother. The church should always remember everyone and not allow anyone to be lost. So it's very powerful to me. It is deeply, for me, a challenge as a priest to remember words matter, what we say to people. And I think Pope Francis spent a great section of Evangelii Gaudium talking about homilies. So some people will be wondering, why is the Pope bothering about teaching us how to preach? We are great preachers, eh? Some people think. But one thing I took away anytime I go back to that text of Pope Francis is the language. The language. So yeah, that's the church should never forget. Always remember those who are lost. And who are those who are lost? So I'll leave it at that.
And a poignant point to make, particularly on All Souls Day, as we remember the dead and those who are lost. Darren, in your experiences and your interviews, was there one that stuck out with you as particularly a moment of insight or learning?
In a way, it's unfair, the question, because there were so many moments. I mean, the experience was for me, existentially, very transformative, and that was sort of the coalescing of many insights for each of, whether it was a group or individual interview. They were so impressive to me in so many different ways. From their continued, for some who were interviewed, whether it was members of the LGBTQI or the Network for Women's Equality, or people who had been marginalized by the church, and as Stan said, but still had faith, and and who didn't let the church be the cause of their loss of faith, in a way, and who, though they may be worshiping in part of other communities because they don't find a home in the Catholic Church, still feel connected and yet exiled. So this was a common trope, I think, in a few of the interviews. But there's one or two, I think, that really I sort of stuck with me a long time after the interview and continued to interpolate me in many ways. And the first was from Janet. Janet is somebody who experiences disablement. That is a society that puts up barriers, that makes her invisible, that renders her, right, from, steps. Let's say if everything has steps, somebody who can't climb steps suddenly can't go to those places where there's steps. They're then rendered invisible, right, because they're not there. So there's ways, so she's been rendered invisible in what we call sort of disability. And she said to me, Jesus never made anyone invisible. In fact, his ministry was to make people visible. He sought people out who were made invisible in his time, and he gave them place and he made them visible. And she said, like, okay, he didn't do that to all the time, but every time the opportunity arose, he went out to make those who were invisible visible, and to engage them and to put them at the center of the narrative. And for me, that was to root it in Scripture and in the person of Jesus was quite an insight. Another really powerful insight moment for me was when Michael, a member of the LGBTQI community, he spoke about how him and his partner, when a new pastor comes to town, and they're very active in the parish. I mean, I think parish the parishes they belong to are what they are because of their activity. But they have to sort of explain to the pastor in case things get uncomfortable, their nature of their relationship and their engagement in the parish. And they see this, you might get resentful for having to do this after a while. They've been together for many, many years. But they see it as a moment of accompaniment, right? It's the margins accompanying the center. It's the people who are made peripheral accompanying the center of a parish, the pastor, to understand beyond his experience of what relationships might look like. And they've received letters from former pastors thanking them for this. And I would say they didn't use the word ministry, but it's like a ministry. They did use the word accompaniment. They were quite intentional about that, or he was quite intentional about that. But I think it's a ministry of an accompaniment, but it's reversed, in that way that Jesus in the Gospels reverses things so often. This is a total reversal. And that really stuck with me. And they understand that as being part of their ministry, right? They understand that they're doing this intentionally. And I think the last one that really stuck with me, and it's because Stan at the beginning spoke about synodality and how this process is part of a wider process that the church is undertaking. And it was from somebody who was reflecting on her time in ministry in the 70s and 80s. And it was such a time of creativity and collaboration in ministry. And she had a powerful experience of collaboration in ministry, men and women together, in a sort of a non-hierarchical way. And so she said, I want the Pope to know that this isn't some kind of future dream. Some of us experienced this already. What the Pope is asking us for, we've tried it after the council. It stopped. But there's lots of reasons to be hopeful, because in terms of how we live church, these things were done. And she wanted to tell that story as sort of a historical, somewhat of a lament, but also a reason to hope. And when I thought about that, in my sort of darker moments, when I say, what church am I committed to? I think, what, there's hope, because we've done it before and we can do it again. So that was my third really powerful experience. Third, as I said, there were many. The people listening opens you up in so many ways.
I know it's an unfair question. I know it's an unfair question. And I do want, before I ask the next question, I want to say to anybody of the attendees, if anybody has a question they would like to pose to the theologians on the panel, to please put it in the chat, or I can see the Q&A if you don't want to post it where everyone can see it. So that, and we do have one. So rather than asking my last question, I'm going to ask this one first. And it comes from, it says, this is a great project and such powerful stories. Did you develop recommendations on how these texts or stories from the existential peripheries can or should enter into and change the process of teaching and creating theology? And if so, what are some of your recommendations? And it's funny that actually is very close to my next, which was going to be to ask, how does this shaping or impacting your understanding of your own vocation as a theologian? But this question's better. Is there anyone that would like to start before I call on somebody?
Yeah, I can go first. The project was designed also to include pastoral guidebooks, and these have already been developed. Some of them are already on the website. Some have not yet been cleared to be put on the website. Personally, I think that, and I think there are many theologies about solutions, but I don't think that solutions are easy to come by. I think listening to people and paying attention to people is a very good way of seeing where God is leading all of us. We need to be actually slow in proffering solutions because there has been a lot of destructive solutions. And I mean, it's not just a church problem, it's also for some of us who work in international development. If you look at the kind of destructive economies we have in the world today, solutions to this, solution to that. Now, some of the solutions we have offered as a church have not really worked. So we need more to be searchers. And I think that's also the strategy of Pope Francis, that rather than constantly planning, and Pope John Paul II also said it at the beginning of the new millennium, in his document Novo Millennio Innovente, where he said we have to also be slow. The plan has already been given. The gospel is the plan of Jesus. Either we live the gospel or we're not. So what's happening is that we are not living, we live or we are not. It depends on how you look at it. So we have to be very careful that we understand where people are today in the world. And I think that's the most important urgent concern, at least from the way I'm reading this book, rather than offering solutions that often create more problems. Maybe the periphery should give us solution, rather, let me put it that way. So they should be, the migrants should give us solution, the prisoners should give us solution, not those of us outside the wall. We don't give solution to the prisoners that might only worsen their condition. I'm sorry if I didn't make the problem or the concern of the questioner easier. If I complicated it more, maybe that's also what Pope Francis says. We need to make a mess. We need to make a mess. Thank you.
I like that. I like when he says it too. We especially when he says to young people, we need to make a mess. Jen or Darren, would you like to weigh in?
Should I go first, Jen? Yeah. I think it's a really good question, and it was one that at my university we were talking about having an event on the 10th of November, and some of my colleagues said, we should do an event, but this can't be the end of the process. If this is a good idea, we as a Catholic university and certainly theology faculties and religious studies departments have a responsibility to take this seriously. And so it's a bit like what Stan's saying, because it's such a complicated and complex issue, this we like to think is maybe the end of the final report of these studies, but maybe the beginning of something longer. And we've all committed to this in various ways, but it also means getting our colleagues on board and saying, let's create a culture where theology is done in a synodal way, or where theology is done from the margins. Now, what does it actually mean? Like, okay, we'll figure that out slowly, step by step, but together, and we'll probably make a bunch of mistakes on the way. I think the other thing in terms of that question around our theologizing, our methods could change. I'm a pretty classically trained systematician. I don't need to engage anybody to write an article or to do my theology, right? And then you get a publication and then you submit it in your annual review. But if we take this type of theologizing seriously, it might actually change what counts for us as teachers of theology. And that means rethinking maybe even our university system. And within our classes, I think there's lots of room to think about curriculum and experiential learning, to think about what assignments we give to students. Like, again, do you write a paper? What is it that do you have to have 20 sources on your bibliography? Or does it mean going out and listening and articulating and naming theologically, or trying to name theologically, the experience of people on the margins? Like that's, and then how do you grade that? And so there's, it becomes complicated, but I think that there are ways. But I think, as Stan says, they're not easy ways, but I would say we look to, as a theological community, we look to the nature of the university, of what counts in theological faculties, how we construct our curriculum, and then how we teach those courses.
a couple of thoughts come to mind. I mean, first, I think has to do with the gratitude that I feel, particularly for my elders in Hispanic theology, who've been using methods like these for a long, long while. Like that work of accompaniment, of acompañamiento, we say. I mean, that has been, I think, at the heart of the work of so many. I'm thinking of systematicians like Orlando Espín, Maria Pilar Aquino, Roberto Goizueta. I'm thinking about biblical scholars like Jean-Pierre Ruiz, contextual theologians like Carmen Ninco Fernandez, and then Ana Maria Isasi Diaz. She's an ethicist, and I think she would be thrilled that we're using methods that resonate so deeply with those that she developed with Yolanda Tarango, who's still with us, and in pastoral ministry in South Texas. But these theologians very much pioneered methods that I think can inform this work, and I think have informed this work in some ways. I mean, these folks have been exercising a preferential option for the poor in their approach to their disciplines, but also, and I'm thinking particularly of Nanco Fernandez's work, a preferential option for culture, right? To sort of acknowledge that, you know, the cultures that we inhabit, the social locations that we bring, aren't we can't leave them behind when we experience church, when we do theology. So I'm very grateful, I think, to sort of have been formed in that, like by those methods and by those people, frankly, right? Especially through their work. And I think this project too just gives me a lot of hope. I mean, what would it be like for us to continue to listen as Stan and as Darren have lifted up? What would it be like for us to continue to discern collectively, as Francis invites us to do? And what might it be like to acknowledge the gifts that lie at the peripheries? I think that's one of the things that the reports, not only from North America, but from the other working groups, very much highlight.
Thank you. What I can't help but smile because, you know, the Roberto Goizueta was my teacher. And right, I mean, and that profoundly shapes my understanding of accompaniment. And it's not accidental that all of this is happening under Pope Francis, who comes from Argentina, and Aparecida, and all of the things related to the synod and this moment. We frequently find that our Latin American colleagues and the church in Latin America is significantly ahead of the North American church on listening to each other, on small communities, on base communities, on synodal process, on processes across, right? You think of Salem, across countries and bishops' conferences. The thing I wanted to say, and it's to piggyback on Darren's point, I think part of this is that theologians, as theologians, have to unlearn a bit of the way in which the academy has patterned us in order to do scholarship. Because I think, for me at least, the most radical thing that this demands of me as a theologian is that I cede control over the questions. And we're trained and we're used to investigating the questions that we find interesting, that push beyond, right, the things that we've researched. And this, I mean, it's not just theology, right, but this is that kind of silo of the academy. So it's not even just Darren's point about all he needs is his books in his computer to write an article. The extension of that is that where the questions come from and who gets to decide what questions are the pertinent ones. That's what I think the radical challenge, to answer the question that we got from Therese, is that we need to cede the authority, and it's not just slow things down, but slow things down such that yeah, some of the things we look at might be, right, like we became scholars for a reason, but scholars for whom? And that has to not just be scholars for scholarship's sake. If you're doing Catholic theology, it has to be scholarship for the church And that's not just us, and that's not just the bishops. That's not just the hierarchy. And so that, I think, for me is because I've done fieldwork based moral theology before, and there is a sense in which most of our community doesn't know what to do with it, in terms of what, right? How does it count in as theology? How does it count as scholarship? Those kinds of questions. And part of it is becoming more comfortable with ceding one aspect of the power we do have as theologians. Colleen asked, how have we struggled with the notion of margin, the power implications of being the one who names who is at the center and who is not? I know I have, in part in terms of seeing it for me as, right, as who's pushed out of whose voices are silenced in either by society or the church. But what about, and I know we've talked about this as a group, does anyone else want to share how they grappled with the question of margin and periphery and power? Darren?
I mean, I can just quickly say, I mean, we did struggle with it as a group, and I continually think, what's the best term for this? What's the relationship between center and margin? But the one thing that I did in my own interviews, in the process of setting these up, I asked the people if they would self-identify in that way and what that meant. So and I think that was important, and they all said yes, and they gave me the reasons, and they were very clear, and reasons why. And so I think that's also important, at least in terms of our method, is to say to people, here's why I think you'd be a candidate to be interviewed. I'd love to hear your story, but it's because we're considering you from the margins. And I did use the term margins. I didn't use the term existential peripheries very often, but just to say they did self-identify. And I think that's a really important part, is to say that those who, at least in the people that I interviewed, they would squarely situate themselves in solidarity as marginalized people by church or society, and in solidarity with those that they would also consider marginalized.
Dan or Jen, anything quick you want to add? The last question as we wrap up that I wanted to ask is, so for those who are logged on or who will watch this later, all of this was done essentially in less than 1 year. It was a very short, kind of crazy timeline. And so there's much that we weren't able to accomplish due to that accelerated timeline that we did not set, but that was the project framework that everyone in this global project had. And I do think that is the unique thing about what is different about this project, is I don't know of any project like this, coordinated by an office at the Holy See, with teams of theologians on each continent, working in this way. We talk about margins and power, right? But there's an institutional quality to being asked to do this, and for people to be asked, being asked their stories, that I think as theologians on our own, we can't quite replicate. There is something to the fact that that they felt like the Pope and the Vatican and the Holy See cared about their stories, that mattered. What is one thing that you wish you had been able to do that we weren't able to do in this time frame? And is there something you think you might follow up on next? While you think, because I can see the looks on your faces. For me, I lament that we were not able to include any voices from the Caribbean, because they are technically part of North America, but given just a whole host of things and our timeline, it just didn't work. And that is one thing that I lament, and I hope that if this moves into another phase, that those voices can be incorporated at that next stage. I know what comes next in thinking about the theologizing about out of this project. I hope that we'll be able to work together across regional groups. I would love to sit down with some of our colleagues from the other continental groups from Asia and Africa and Latin America and Europe, and for me personally, and sit and kind of talk about and read each other's stories on women's experiences in particular, and see kind of the way the new synod document did of kind of lifting up the convergences and differences across regions. That's for me what I hope might happen next. And now I'll call on Jen.
I would echo that, Megan. I share in that lament that Caribbean voices weren't included in this first round. And I think, too, I just share in that hope and that curiosity about what might come next, particularly around some of those points of convergence that you've lifted up. And I was talking with a colleague in ministry in Chicago last week, sort of sharing a little bit with her about this project. And I was saying, like, I'm so excited to see what comes next, right? I'm so excited to be able to start to share with folks about it. And she was saying, you know, like, as people sort of connect with one another around this work and embracing these methods, she was saying, like, we're getting to participate in the building up of God's kingdom. And her framing, I think, just speaks to that really, really clearly. It's like, what might be, like, let's be curious together, and do, act on what we're learning from this listening and from this collective discernment.
Darren?
Yeah, I lament that in the short time frame I didn't have a chance to meet and listen to Indigenous communities in Canada, because it's a very important issue. It was just a timeline. I did meet with the biracial Métis woman, but it was not possible to organize that, and that's just such an important voice in Canada. And certainly we saw it even result in an apostolic visitation by the Pope. So I would still like to hear from that community, and maybe even more now in the wake of the visit and the new dynamism, hopefully, that's being given to reconciliation in Canada. That would be a group that I'd still really like to hear from.
And Stan?
I think I'm grateful for what has been accomplished. My favorite parable is the parable of the seed. That is thrown. You know, you go to bed, you wake up in the morning, and you don't know how it's growing. So, yeah, the seed has been planted, the word has gone out, and interestingly, you notice that less than few days after we were in Rome, the Pope decided to add one more year to the synod. Now, I can't go into details, but you will ask, why did he add one more year? So this report has a life that is beyond each and every one of us. So because when this report got into the hands of people who are working on this continental draft, is a treasure trove, and it requires a lot of time for people to study and integrate. So I think that we need to continue working together, and we need to take time, first of all, to digest what we have. This was very intense. Mm-hmm. It's very intense. So I am taking some time to pray and listen again to these voices as I'm reading all the regional reports. And I think the Vatican is also learning the lesson about, God's time and human time. So you got to get this done and get it done at this particular time. And now we see that is not the stories of people, the footprints of God that we have to follow, and it takes time. So that's I'm going to, in the spirit of Advent that is coming, I'm going to wait upon the Lord. I'm going to wait upon the Lord, not folding my hand, but really reading through this and thinking of what we can do together, as we were a wonderful team, an incredible team of people. How I wish theologians can, and I don't like self-adulation or group adulation, but we need some dose of realism about what really matters. And I think sometimes theologians and church leaders, we do, there's a lot of idolatry among us. Whatever it is, this kind of work we did is a process, can trigger a process of conversion. I think that's where I am. The conversion experience is just beginning. And I hope the good Lord can show me the way as I work with the rest of my brothers and sisters here in charting the course for our next step.
Thank you. That is a fitting place for us to conclude. I want to thank my colleagues and friends for joining us and sharing this. We'll go up on YouTube hopefully tomorrow so that others can watch it. I got many Twitter and emails asking, this will be recorded, right? And so I also want to invite everyone who is present to also join with us for a lunchtime chat on safe water as a human right on November 15th at 12:15. Afu Chantal Bengale is the country director for IRC Mali, where she works on WASH and human rights. She's herself was a International Movement of Catholic student leader when she was a college student, and she'll be in conversation with 3 of our excellent undergraduates during that panel, and all are welcome. And that too afterwards will get recorded and put up on our YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and I hope everyone has a good night.